Of all the creatures that inhabit the forest where I like to walk, perhaps the most industrious are the acorn woodpeckers. They spend their time drilling thousands of holes, tap, 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 up and down and all around the tallest ponderosa pine trees in the forest. From a distance, those trees just look riddled with holes, but up close you can see that each hole holds a precious treasure, an acorn. They're called granary trees, and when they are well stocked, they will ensure that the woodpeckers have food to eat when the acorns are no longer in season. Clever birds. I imagine that they delight in seeing their acorn-studded trees, much like we love to see our own cupboards full of jams and salsas, dried fruits, rice, beans. Whether you process these things yourself or buy them from the store, we can all agree that putting up food is smart because it ensures that we will eat during the off-season. And when we preserve perishable food, it is not wasted. That's God's plan, right? Well, I think so. But then there's this little thing Jesus said, as remembered in Luke's account, chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. A crowd is gathered around Jesus, thousands of people, we are told. He is speaking primarily to his disciples when suddenly his lesson is interrupted by an anonymous bystander who has a personal request for the famous rabbi. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves but are not rich toward God." Well, I feel like Jesus has just chopped down my granary tree, or at least taken a swing at my admiration of the hard-working acorn woodpeckers who store their abundant harvests in them. Seriously though, is Jesus really calling it foolish to plan for the future? Should we reconsider the wisdom of the 401k and just plan to work until we die? Is that really God's wisest plan for us? This little story is called the Parable of the Rich Fool. First question, how was the man foolish? Because he certainly was no fool when it came to farming. When someone brings in a harvest that exceeds their greatest expectations, more food than the storage barns are even built to hold, I think most of us would call that successful. If you were that farmer pulling in a super crop, you would be living the dream. Such a thing is a gift, and Scripture even has songs that celebrate an abundant harvest. Psalm 107 lists the many things God has done for the people, like allowing them to live in a fertile land where they sow fields and plant vineyards and get a fruitful yield. That psalm, however, closes with this advice: let those who are wise pay attention to these things and consider the steadfast love of the Lord. Well, those who are wise do consider the steadfast love of God as the source of blessing. But that's not the case with the farmer in Jesus' parable. When he was blessed with an abundant yield, he did not give thanks to God or consider God's steadfast love. His thought process took a different direction, inwardly focused like this: what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Instead of praising God from whom all blessings flow, instead of wondering how this surplus of grain might fit into God's will to bless all God's people here below, the farmer's song of praise is sung to the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, I, my. Oh my, what a selfish guy. The only time he says you, he is addressing neither God nor neighbor. He is addressing his own soul. Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. We are allowed to laugh here because it's kind of funny in a tragicomic way. Eat, drink, and be merry is what you say to your guests at a dinner party. Cue the soundtrack of clinking cutlery and wine glasses singing the duet of the toast. But this guy is planning a party for one, inviting only his own soul. I am not sure whether to laugh or cry. It makes me kind of sad the way the Ebenezer Scrooge character makes me sad, you know, in the Charles Dickens novel, The Christmas Story. So much wealth, yet so much loneliness, which is clearly not part of God's plan. And just like Scrooge, our rich farmer is faced with the startling revelation that his financial success is all pointless, for his number is up. He cannot take a single grain of his harvest with him, so what is the point of the wealth? What good is any of it to anyone? That's exactly the problem, right? All that wealth is no good to anyone except the one person who won't even live long enough to stuff himself full of it anyway. That's why the man is a fool, hoarding all that grain as though it would bring him joy. For even if he did live long enough to eat it all, relaxing and getting fat, how could he enjoy it while others around him might be going without? Sharing does not seem to have occurred to him, nor does selling his crop, and we could debate whether selling or sharing would be the better choice, but there is no question at all that hoarding is not the wise thing to do. Jesus is coming down pretty hard against those who store up treasures for themselves but are not rich toward God, which means being generous toward those in need, as is clearly outlined in the religious law Jesus' people were expected to follow. The Reverend Peter Gomes describes being rich toward God like this. He says, wealth is not what you have. Wealth is what you have been given that enables you to give to others, right? Blessed to be a blessing. If God's plan is for the prosperous to be generous, then the rich man's greed was foolish. Now, in Jesus' time, many people were experiencing hunger. Excessive Roman taxes had caused many people to lose their land and livelihood. So the idea of a rich landowner hoarding an abundant harvest, wastefully tearing down perfectly good barns just to build bigger ones to keep his grain that is certainly better when eaten sooner rather than saved for many years. Just think of the rodents. How foolish, how out of sync with God's wisdom in allowing enough food to grow so that all can eat. Take care, Jesus had warned. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. What then does one's life consist of? What is more precious than material wealth? What will satisfy our deepest cravings and bring us true joy? Remember the words of the psalmist. Let those who are wise pay attention to these things and consider the steadfast love of the Lord. First and foremost that, God's steadfast love lasts forever, unlike the grain that goes moldy over time. And God's steadfast love not only lasts forever, but it transforms those who will embrace it into people who do God's will through showing love to others. Remember how Jesus taught us to pray, give us this day our daily bread, not give me enough bread to store up so I don't have to work anymore. The collective need is named in prayer, shaping us into a generous people. That is God's will, that we should be generous, not greedy, like the farmer in the parable. And we've talked a lot about that guy, the hypothetical rich farmer in Jesus' story, but let's not forget that he was telling the story to a real person, someone in the crowd who revealed his own greed by trying to get Jesus to side with him against his own brother. What he wanted was for his brother to split the family inheritance with him, which might sound fair enough, but the inheritance law of the time was structured in such a way that each brother should be given their appropriate share. So either that brother was refusing or the guy asking was trying to weasel more than his fair share. And either way, Jesus is not getting in the middle of that family feud. "Friend," he said, "who set me to be judge or arbitrator over you?" And then, addressing all of the others, he said, "Take care and be on your guard against all kinds of greed." Remember, one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. What our lives do consist of are healthy relationships with God and one another. Our relationship with God is based upon praise and gratitude, and our relationship with others are built upon mutual care and concern for each other's well-being. It's about generosity, not greed. "Beware of all kinds of greed," warned Jesus, "for nothing breaks a relationship like the desire for more wealth." Now, wealth is not necessarily a sin, but it can be a problem when it gets in the way of relationship. You've probably seen it yourself, how quickly the mere idea of wealth can turn people against each other, even the closest of family members. Just say the word inheritance at a family gathering and watch the mood shift. About 5 years ago, a friend of mine called his brother to say that their father had suffered a stroke. Now, the brother immediately wanted to know how much money he would be getting from the inheritance. Nothing, my friend told him, because their father hadn't actually died, and their mother was doing just fine. They haven't spoken since. 5 years. This parable leaves us with something to consider. What is our relationship to material wealth? And how does that relationship impact our other relationships with God and others? And because this parable highlights the folly of thinking only about me, myself, and I, it offers a natural invitation for us to consider the implications for the hoarding of resources on a collective level. Like, what if water-rich places refuse to let water flow to the arid valleys where food must be grown to feed more people? What if entire nations hoarded grain that was needed to feed the world? Food shortages and famine are never due to God's refusal to give us our daily bread, but to the foolishness of human beings who delight in labeling things as mine, mine, all mine. The problem isn't lack of resource, but lack of stewardship. And having an abundance isn't a sin. It can be quite useful if used well. John Wesley, founder of early Methodism, recommended that people earn as much as possible so that they could save as much as possible in order to be as generous as possible. You can have wealth and use it wisely, though many might consider great generosity the sign of foolishness. As followers of Jesus, we are called to an ethics that contradict the messaging we hear elsewhere. We are called to see every blessing, not as a merit-based reward for our own cleverness and industry, but as a gift from God, not meant to enrich us personally, but to share with others whom God also considers worthy of blessing. This applies not only to our material resources, but to our time and our talent. What have you received in abundance? And how might you be called to share that gift for the blessing of others? When we discover that, we discover our purpose, the true meaning of our life, which, as Jesus said, does not consist in the abundance of possessions. As I think again about the granary trees, I think I understand something thanks to Jesus' parable. No one tree belongs to any one woodpecker. The trees are everywhere so that all who hunger may gather to eat. And I think that's what it's all about. All who hunger gather gladly.